What dark secret family history have you uncovered? We found a picture of two great aunts arm in arm with Hitler. That my great grandpa left England for America and was supposed to send money for them to come over. But he never did. He just started a new family in America. Yeah. This kind of used to happen a lot. Husband father leaves and heads out west to make his fortune and will send for the family when he has the money but ends up meeting someone new instead. I have to wonder if that kind of thing is still happening today. All the unrest in certain countries. Refugees fleeing and families sometimes being broken up. I wonder how many people just say, I'm starting fresh. Found out my father had a secret family in that we worried. His wife and kids don't know about us to this day. Also found out a while later that an uncle had an ex-wife and kids he kept quiet about too. My great grandfather had 3 families. 2 in the States and 1 in Canada. My uncle got his wife pregnant at 17. He was 30 and that's why her family got so angry. I always noticed that my aunt seemed really young. When I grew up and did the math, I realized that my uncle impregnated her and married her when she was 14. He was 19. There are 2 killers on my dad's side of the family. One murdered his wife. The other was a female serial killer, Eileen Wuornos. A movie was made about her, Monster, and she was my dad's cousin's child. Never met either one though. Have a second cousin that murdered his siblings and parents for insurance money. He didn't get away with it, but only spent around 20 years in prison. He's out now, but no one talks about him or will speak to him. The only reason I even know is my parents warned me if he ever reaches out to me that I shouldn't talk to him. I managed to find out about him and what happened by googling him. Edit. To answer the questions. The murders happened in the late 70s. He was sentenced to 45 years. But only served 20, he was a minor. After he got out, it caused a pretty big uproar to the point that they changed the law. Believe it or not, if he does contact you, the first thing you tell him is I don't have any life insurance. Edit. Thanks for the gold. My grandfather, white, may have fathered 1 or 2 kids with the black lady across the street. This was a big no-no in the southern U.S. in the 1940s. Hey. My mother told me a story about being at a small funeral in the late 1950s. East Texas. The deceased was mentally challenged, and the family was relieved to have the child at peace. During the service, the coffin began to rock, and crying was heard. Then she was taken outside and watched as the coffin was carried to the cemetery next to the church and hurriedly buried. I was telling my kids this years later, and my mother walked in the room, listened for a moment, and asked, "Are you telling them about Uncle Chucky?" "What? You seem to have forgotten to mention the connection before, Mom." Edit. I cannot swear to the authenticity of the tale, but my mother swore by it and she was not the joking sort. It has caused a decent amount of dark brooding about being buried alive in my youth. When my mother died, I found out my uncle is really my dad. Last year visiting my grandparents back home in NZ for their 60th wedding anniversary, I found out that my great-great-grandfather married his sister. I was with my mother, cousins, and aunt, and we all just kinda glossed over it and didn't dig too deep into it. Wasn't so bad for me cause my mother was adopted, so there's no biological relation. But damn. My great-grandfather was a Nazi captain. Like pretty high up. He even had Heinrich Himmler himself over for dinner at one time if I recall correctly. After the war was over he fled and got prosecuted. Not sure what happened to him after that. It's not exactly dark per se, but my great uncle on my father's side is widely considered an idiot. So my dad's family are very recent immigrants from Italy. And I guess my great uncle decided he wanted to visit his homeland. He was born there, but raised in America. The problem was he apparently was completely oblivious to what was going on in the world. Because he went to Italy in 1938. He ended up getting drafted into the Italian military since he was born there. Unfortunately for him, he was completely unaware he didn't actually have to join the Italian military, as the US would have contested it had he tried to get into contact with an embassy or something. Luckily for him, he was only assigned to patrol around Italy, and Italy surrendered turned on Mussolini before the Allies advanced far enough to encounter my great uncle. It was all apparently very awkward since my grandfather and the rest of his brothers had been part of the US military and fought in Europe. TLDR. My great uncle is probably the only guy to accidentally join the wrong side of World War II. Edit. Passé. My mother's best friend, Peggy Catino, was abducted and killed by serial killer Pee Wee Gaskins while walking home from school. My mom left her on a street corner to run get something she left behind at school. Got back and she was gone. Never seen again until she was found dead in the woods. Me. I went to Rome this summer. Grandpa. That's great. I was in Rome once. Me. What did you see when you went? Grandpa. Oh, you know. I just marched where they told me to march. Hint. He's not American. It wasn't necessarily a secret, but nobody talked about the picture on the mantle at my aunt and uncle's. I found out a few years ago that they had lost their oldest child, of 3, when he was 11 to leukemia. He had been my dad's best friend. Changed a lot about who they were and gave me new perspective on them. Sweetest people ever. But there is a never-ending sadness there. Parents should never have to bury their children. Not a secret or anything, but my great-grandmother survived the Armenian genocide at some point by playing dead and hiding under dead bodies. Family members told us the story that my uncle's wife died in a car accident they were both involved in. They live out of state. After he was arrested, we found out that the accident was him running his convertible under a semi-truck and decapitating her on purpose. There's a long line of abuse in my family on my dad's side. I don't know all the details, but from what I gathered, my great-grandpa was possibly sexually abusive to my dad. He was also abusive toward his wife and daughter, my grandma. No one talks about it directly since he died several years ago. There is just a lingering tone of disgust when discussing my great-grandfather. Also, my happy-go-lucky grandfather, who is a sweet man now, was definitely abusive towards my dad. Unfortunately, this led to my dad being horribly ed up and abusive towards my mom. Thankfully never to my sister and I. He wanted to stop the cycle of abusing children, but it just didn't translate to his spouse. My mom eventually divorced his ass. He got therapy and is doing much better. I refuse to perpetuate the cycle. It's not easy. And I have anger issues too. But there's no way in hell I will letting my son have a childhood like his predecessors. My great uncle stole a train while drunk. He was just trying to get his life on track. Obligatory thanks for the Goldaroo edit. Great Gramps was a Nazi. My mother left her sister to die in an apartment when she should have taken her to the hospital for gastric bleeding or something to that effect. Mom still doesn't understand why she wasn't invited to the funeral services for her parents. She's a classic narcissistic money sucking. It's kind of weird. My dad was involved with some criminals in California. It wasn't like the blacklist or some, but they organized and did some pretty tight things. My dad doesn't tell me much, but I do remember that we moved to Ohio with no real prompting. Years later, I'm talking to him about my family history and ask him why we moved hella far from the family. My father was quiet for a few minutes and just breathing heavily. E. Dad. Something wrong? D. Son. We moved because I saw a man kill a baby and I had to get out of that organization. M. I just moved on. I don't even know anything about my father's past. And now I'm sure I don't want to. My great-grandparents were first cousins. They had 2 sons who were severely intellectually disabled. And instead of putting them in an institution, which is what everyone did at the time, my great-grandparents bought a farm out in the country and kept them home. They both died fairly young. My grandmother never mentioned any of this. I found out after she died by doing some genealogical research. Also, my maternal grandmother had a stillborn son. She told me about giving birth to him one day. I was her caregiver in the last year before she died, and how they buried him at the feet of a single woman who had died. My mother and none of her siblings knew any of this. She also had 2 miscarriages. So 8 pregnancies and 5 kids. In the military. Found out my grandpa was on his deathbed. Jumped through several hoops to take a week of emergency leave to make it to his funeral and support my dad through the ordeal. Spent the week helping the family out. 2 days before the funeral, I found out that my grandpa was a raging pedophile who had sexually assaulted several of my cousins and attempted to assault my sister. Most of my family knew about the rumors, but not that he had went after my sister. Everyone still went to the funeral under the pretense of supporting my grandma, even though she was in denial about the abuse and claimed the kids made it up. I can't look at her the same, and even though I love my family to death, I don't know how they can act like this never happened. I left the morning of the funeral. That bastard died too good of a death, and I hope someone waters the flowers on his grave with her. My great aunt and uncle were the sweetest people imaginable. When I was growing up, they lived 4 houses down, so I used to go around to their house a lot after school. My uncle Jimmy used to play dollies and tea party with me. I have very fond memories of them. When my uncle Jimmy died, I remember all these very professional looking old men at his funeral, surrounded by what looked like to me security guards. My mum casually mentioned to me many years later that my uncle Jimmy was an old-fashioned English gangster. He did time for robbery and sex trafficking. He was also accused of murdering 4 people, but there wasn't enough evidence to prosecute. I was gobsmacked. Additional to this, my lovely auntie Diane. His wife was the madam at one of his brothels and recruited his sex slaves. She had also done time. I put 2 and 2 together and realized those men at his funeral were old gangsters. It really messed me up. Not really super dark, but it was supposed to be secret. I was conceived in a threesome between my mother, my dad, and his identical twin. Can't get a DNA test because they're identical twins. But the one who took on the role of uncle bought me a pony when I was a kid, so it's cool. Not exactly dark. But after my grandpa died, we were going through his stuff and found an old letter. My white, very Christian, very conservative grandpa had gotten kicked out of college for organizing a panty raid, and somehow no one ever knew. Of course. My great grandfather was a bootlegger. And later, allegedly a cannibal during the Great Depression. I say allegedly because his friends claimed it was a rumor he started to keep people from messing with his family. They could never disprove it, though, because even up to his death he swore he'd eaten a rival's liver. I should note he was a Native American, so he got the nickname Wen, short for Wendigo. My grandpa said it was all for show, though, cause Wen had to fight over things like milk and threaten the power company employees to keep them from turning the power off. I have no idea how much is true, cause it seemed to be embellished all the way up to my grandpa's death. My great grandmother was a dirty Irish scamming, sorry nanny. In World War II she used to scam multiple American and British soldiers who would come to Liverpool, be sent to the European front all at once into marrying her, then collect a percentage of their pay and pawn any jewelry she was given. She was the Queen of Dependus. My ancestors are from North India. Before the Indian partition, we were spread out all over Pakistan, Himachal, Kashmir, etc. I have 118 second cousins on my dad's side. He has 55 cousins. I only have 16 second cousins on my mom's side. I found out the reason that we had so few cousins on my mom's side is that all of my grandmother's family was massacred during partition. They lived in what is now Pakistan and didn't get across the border in time. She refuses to tell us how she escaped or how she ended up in India. She found her elder brother that lived in Himachal, so had some family. On my maternal grandfather's side, a lot of his cousins died from disease. Also, I'm pretty sure that one of my great aunts was a Muslim who was forced into marriage as some form of vengeance. People in my grandfather's family were also killed during partition. There is a lot of blood on both sides. We live in the States now, but I am still fascinated by these stories. If you are older than 35, you were alive the last time our lynching tree was used. Edit. Everyone keeps asking me, so here's the story. In the 80s, a mentally unstable migrant worker attacked and upheaded a local handicapped girl. Vigilante mob found out about it, caught the guy, beat him senseless, dragged him behind a pickup truck, and finally strung him up in a well-known oak tree on our plantation. They say none of my family was involved. At IDK, we had relatives in the clan. The law supposedly got involved, but everything was soon forgotten, swept under the rug. I knew my grandmother had my oldest uncle out of wedlock to someone else, and was pregnant a second time when she married my grandfather. He was a brave man to take on someone else's child in the 1930s. Years later, after my parents had died, I was doing a little family history and looked at my uncle's birth date and my grandma's birth date. She would have been 14 or 15. The baby daddy was supposed to be some rich prick who took advantage of her when she worked in the big house. Supposedly. I don't know about her and my granddad. When you look at this sweet little old lady, you couldn't imagine her being in that situation. Even in the few photos we have when she was younger than I am now. It's hard to imagine. And I guess now, I'll never know. My aunt's husband is a child molester and molested all 3 of the female children living in the household. I've disconnected with them, but last I heard they're still married. Also, my dad beat his mentally and physically handicapped brother. Pretty recent discovery. My great uncle is having his funeral tomorrow. My father has fond memories of running in taxed booze from distilleries to mob members with him. Turns out that's why no one talks about him. I learned I had a sister. She was given up for adoption at birth, years before my other sister and myself were born. My mother found her a few years ago. I've never met her still. She's doing well though. Pretty cool to me. My brother had this theory about my grandpa, who died like 20 years before I was born. Our grandfather used to own land. Lots of it. He was shot, but due to his poor health, he didn't survive. Come 10-20 years later in late 90s, early zeros, nada, zip, 0 of my grandfather's land is owned by my family. My brother thinks it was a plan to kill him and acquire possession of the land he owned. But the oldest aunt's uncles would not talk about it all. So, not really a secret, but my grandpa, 26 years, stole my grandmother when she was 14. I say stole because he took her without her parents' permission, but she left with him willingly. They were married for 25 years before my grandmother passed away. My gramps became very depressed and passed away 1 month after my grandmother. It's not really a family secret, but it is quite dark. My granddad's older brother's sons are Eddie and Charlie Richardson. They are best known for being the leaders of the Richardson Gang, aka Torture Gang, who were gangsters in South London, most famously known as the main rivals of the Cray twins. Here is a Wikipedia article about them. www.n. Wikipedia. Wiki. The Richardson Gang. They were recently portrayed in the film Legend, 2015. My mother met them when she was a little girl and said they seemed quite nice. I just found out that my mother was divorced by my father via email while he was away working overseas at Sudan. Turns out my dad met his high school ex during work and decided to marry her. You know, first love and stuff. Soon after she received the email, she got dressed up, leave the house, leaving me and twin brother alone, while being pregnant with my youngest sister, to fill in divorce papers at the court. Also, my mum struggled so much when she was financially broke after being divorced that she had to go house by house in my neighborhood just to ask for some money support from them. God knows what else she's been through. Edit. Please stop loathing my dad. I believe it was just a mistake. Something that he would done it anyway. And it just happens at wrong timing. Yes, both parties are doing really well. My mum have a very stable job RN. And my dad gets to do the business stuff that he always wanted to do. My siblings are adults ATM. All of us are basically able to handle things by ourselves. Thanks for the kind words. One of my maternal cousins is actually my father's younger brother. So one of your cousins is your uncle on the other side of the family? I'm gonna need a diagram here. I've heard stories about my great aunt being blind, but never actually met her. When I did, I noticed the scars on her temple. And after she left, I asked my grandpa, her brother, about it. When she was young, the town she lived in had a serial rapist about. Her husband worked at the gun store my grandpa managed. One night her husband says he's going out and tells her to lock the door because of the rapist. She does so, and a few hours later sees on the news that the serial rapist is trapped in a house and has a woman and her daughter as hostage. He's trying to negotiate with the police. When he leans out the window holding the young girl and yelling something at the police, she recognizes him as her husband. She goes upstairs, grabs his gun, and puts it to her temple. I have no clue what happened to the husband. I didn't ask. He's probably dead or in prison. I used to be very into genealogy and located a cousin of sorts. He and I emailed back and forth for a while. And he said we have an ancestor relative, not sure what the connection was, who was a Tory during the Revolutionary War. After the war was over and England lost, he abandoned his family and fled to Canada. I actually found that quite amusing. And I have a something great grandmother who was a blockade runner during the Civil War. I'm damned proud of her. My great uncle used to go up by the Hollywood sign and look into Judy Garland's house, which is why you're not allowed up there anymore. My ancestor was Thomas Danforth, a judge in the Salem witch trials. According to Wikipedia, he tried to stop them, though. So hopefully he was actually a cool dude. My family has been very proud of our connection to the founding of the United States. After I did a bit of research, I discovered that some of the stories weren't entirely true. My 8ex-grandfather was a signer of the Mayflower Compact. Then my grandfather and grandmother died almost immediately after landing. A bit later their son came to the new colony and claimed his father's estate. However, I discovered that the signer's son probably wasn't his son. My actual relative was just a gifter and stole someone's estate. My relative who fought in the American Revolutionary War was actually a Tory. He fled to Ontario after the war. Also left out of the family history is slaves. Lots and lots of slaves. I have an aunt who doesn't appreciate my research and won't talk to me. I just came back from a family reunion. I never knew who my grandpa was. Today I learned that his father was a prisoner from the Yugoslavia war. He got tortured when he was 18 years old. That's just unimaginable. Found out my grandmother, who essentially raised me alongside my mother, same house, had a little brother never mentioned before her death. Turns out he committed mass murder on a drinking binge, killing 8 people. Ate a part of one of them. He's one of only a handful of documented cannibals in Canada. There was even a book written about him called Limits of Sanity, I believe. I forget exactly who, but I think it was my grandpa's aunt spent time in an asylum. Her brothers, maybe dad too, dressed as doctors to help her escape after they saw the poor treatment of patients. Oh. And why was she in there? She went insane when her husband died in a car wreck on the way to the hospital where she was giving birth. She put the baby in a tub of scalding hot water. So they locked her up